They're very fatalistic. So they don't see things as negative. They don't see things as positive. They just live, kind of. So this is the story of an old farmer. One day his horse ran away, and all of his neighbors came to visit him to tell him how sad they were, how sorry they were that he lost his horse. And he said, "How can you know it isn't a good thing?" That's what the Chinese farmer said. This story's not over with yet, okay? That's not the end of the story. Yes, the Chinese are very fatalistic. A few days later, the horse came back and it brought back a wild horse with it. So his neighbors came over to congratulate him, and he said, "How do you know this isn't a bad thing?" Being a wise-ass farmer. A few weeks later, the old farmer's son was trying to ride the wild horse and fell off and broke his leg. His neighbors came over to give him condolences again, and he said, "How do you know this isn't a good thing?" Okay, now, this is the end of the story, all right? How can a broken leg be a good thing? The next month, a war started in the country, and all the young men were drafted into the army. And of course, because the young man had a broken leg, he didn't have to go to war. He was the only one he was the only one that lived. The rest of them were killed in the war. I know. So he was right. Every time he was right. Sometimes good things turn out bad, and sometimes bad things turn out good. But of course, that's the way the Chinese see the world. They don't see the world as black and white. They see the world as shades of this strange gray color. And that's the way the Chinese see things. So they're fatalistic. I was reading a book about the Chinese, and it was saying that here these individuals are up, 20 or 30 stories on these bamboo poles, working on the outside of buildings. And people are thinking, "Oh my God, they must be scared to death." No, they're not scared. What happens if they die? What happens next? Do you go someplace?
Yeah.
Well, the Chinese don't think so. Or they think they go to the same place, they're just fatalistic. It doesn't bother them. To die doesn't bother them. That's one of the reasons why during the Korean War, the Chinese would attack en masse. And if they died, they died. If they lived, they lived. But it didn't really bother them to die because they were fatalistic. East Asians have been shown to place more value on things that have happened in the past compared to the future. So they're always looking backwards rather than looking forward. That's the way East Asians are. And that's one of the reasons why they talk so much about their ancestors. They don't want to embarrass their ancestors. They don't want to insult their ancestors. So they try to do the right thing in order to, so that they won't embarrass not themselves, but their ancestors. As curious as that is. Of course, we don't do that in the Western world. North Americans don't do it that way. We see things as the future is more important than the past. So we try to forget the past. And we try to look to the future. Attitudes toward the future vary across cultures, and East Asians have quite different expectations and predictions about the future compared with Westerners, as you can imagine. So now we're going to talk about creativity. Actually, we just started a tariff war with the Chinese. And the reason we started this war is because they keep stealing our technology and manufacturing it and then selling it as their own. And so Trump is upset about that, so he started a tariff war with the Chinese. We put $150 billion tariff on, or we put tariffs on $150 billion worth of stuff that the Chinese send to us. Last night, my birthday was last week, and my wife sent me a new chair. I had to put it together last night. But I noticed that it was made in China. What a shock and surprise. Well, in the future, that chair may be cost her $95. I know it was a president, but the bill of lading was right there. It cost $95. In the future, that chair may cost $125. So we're in a tariff war with the Chinese. That has to do with creativity, and it has to do with the way things go. Television sets were invented in the United States. Radios were invented in Europe and the United States. Typewriters were invented in the United States. Sewing machines were invented in the United States. Walkmen were invented in the United States. However, can you find a Walkman made in the United States? Can you find a typewriter made in the United States? Can you find a computer made in the United States? Manufactured in the United States? Not anymore, no. Everything's overseas. Almost everything's made in China now. In the old days, back in the 60s and 70s, if you had a Japanese car, it was probably not as well made as the American-made car you could have. The American-made car that you might have. If you had a transistor radio, which you guys have no clue what it is, you had a transistor radio and it was made in Japan, it probably would last 3 or 4 months and then it would break down. If you had one made in the United States, it'd last for a lot longer. Now we don't even make these things in the United States. You can't even find things made in the United States. And the reason is because we've sent all of our manufacturing overseas, and there was a reason for that. It's cheaper. The labor was a lot cheaper. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you could get the Chinese government to do it with slave labor. Not a bad deal. That's not a bad deal. I mean, it's real cheap. Slave labor is like nothing. That's how much it costs you. It costs you absolutely nothing. So we would rather manufacture things overseas. However, we keep creating things. We keep making things, robots. Well, Japanese are on top of the robots right now, but once upon a time, all the robots were made in the United States. Not anymore. So when we're talking about creativity, well, we're talking about American ingenuity, we're talking about American creativity. And of course, we keep coming up with new things, and then that technology all of a sudden makes its way over to China, and then we have the Chinese making stuff for us over there. Creativity is the generation of ideas that are novel, useful, and appropriate. That's what creativity is all about, not just art, but also music, also technology that we may possibly put together. Westerners prefer novel objects more than East Asians. They generate a larger number of ideas when they are primed with individualistic thoughts than with collectivistic ones, and Asian Americans show more divergent thinking when primed with American culture compared with Asian culture. So if we brought Asians to the United States or to Canada, because the culture is more individualistic, they would have more creative ideas. They would be allowed more creative ideas. This really seems kind of odd. When they're in their own countries, when they're in their place of origin, their creativity is stifled. And there's a reason for that. And we'll talk about that in just a second. The novelty part of the equation appears to be facilitated by the concept of individualism and Western cultural experiences. So it has to do with our thoughts, our way of looking at the world. We look at the world from the point of view of individualism. And because of that, it's much easier for us to come up with novel ideas. We were living in another country. We were living in Japan. In Japan, if you have an idea, if you dress differently than everybody else, remember I told you that in Japan, 70% of all their cars are white and 20% of all their cars are black. So if you go to Japan, almost every car that passes you is going to be white. It's because everybody wants to be the same. They want to look the same. They don't want to stand out. They don't want to stand out at all. And that's the way it is in Japan. But if you look at the Japanese Americans, people who come to the United States 2 or 3 generations ago, they'll have any color car that they want because they live in now they live in an individualistic society. So their novelty has expanded, their idea of novelty. Yes, ma'am. You were just stretching your arm. Okay, good for you. Good creative ideas involve novel solutions that are appropriate for the problem at hand. Collectivism appears to be associated with the generation of useful rather than novel ideas. So they're not changing things, they're improving things. And the Japanese will tell you that. If you've ever watched the movie Mr. Baseball, which is a fascinating movie, it really is about Japan and about the Japanese culture and how different it is than American culture. Not just the baseball culture, but also the entire culture. One of the things they say in the movie is that we take your ideas and we improve on them. They were talking about beef, a beef steak. He thought he was going to be eating sushi. Of course, he's an American, he doesn't eat raw fish. He thought he was going to be eating sushi, and of course she brings him a Kobe steak. Well, Kobe, I don't know if does anybody know what Kobe meat is, Kobe steak?
Yeah, it's like one of the meat of meat.
Yeah, one of the meat of meat. They actually feed these cows, they feed them beer. And they massage them with beer, as strange as that may sound. So the meat is very, very tender. It's got a lot of fat in it, but it's very, very tender. It's very, very rich. So that's just the way the Japanese do things. In collective context, people are socialized to be concerned about the opinions of others and to find solutions that will fit with the goals of the members of the group. So they're trying to get along. Eastern people try to get along. So if you go to Japan, if you go to Korea, you go to China, what you find is people that want to look the same as everybody else. They don't want to look any different than anybody else. They don't want to act any different than anybody else. Everybody wants to be the same so that they don't stand out. If they do stand out, they feel incorrect. They want to change. So they aren't looking for novelty, they're looking for sameness. But they will improve on things. If they have anything, they'll try to improve on it. So they did this research, and they looked at different people from around the world, and they looked at different groups. When they looked at the Singaporeans, of course, Singapore is at the tip of Malaysia. When Singaporeans were assigned to work together, researchers discovered that they were more likely to comment on appropriateness of their ideas than when they worked by themselves. So they were trying to get along with everybody else. They're trying to do exactly the same as everybody else was doing. Their ideas became less original in groups than they did when they were working by themselves. So then they took a look at people in Israel. And what they discovered, the ideas that they had in Israel, which is a Western society, they found out that their ideas were about the same as they were when they were by themselves as when they were working in a group. They found exactly the same thing with the Dutch. Dutch, another Western country. So when they looked at the ideas that the people were having, they were exactly the same as they were when they were all by themselves. The ideas they had in groups. So they weren't really trying to be appropriate. They were trying to be as creative in one context as they were in the other context. That's the way the Dutch were. That's the way the Israelis were. And then they looked at the Koreans. And what they discovered was that the Koreans were just like the Singaporeans. Rather than having creative ideas as a group, they tried to be appropriate. They wanted to get along with everybody else. Harmony was what they were seeking, rather than novelty. More collectivistic East Asian cultures, with their emphasis on useful ideas, are more likely to foster incremental innovations, whereas more individualistic Western cultures, with their emphasis on novel ideas, encourage more breakthrough ideas. So computers were invented in the all this stuff was invented in the United States. But if you buy a computer today, even if you buy an Apple, where is Apple made? Where do they make Apple computers? In San Francisco? Oh no, they're made in China. Of course they're made in China. Everything's made in China. My shoes. These shoes are from Colorado. Huh? You know where they're made? It's Newton. It's a company out of Boulder, Colorado. They design them, and guess where they're made? Well, Vietnam in this case.
See, I'm looking at my pen. It says China. It's up top.
It's made in China. It's going to be more expensive in the future. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. I keep saying that, don't I? Where was this thing made? Epson. Epson is an American company. Where was it made? This is a Sony, isn't it? No, it's Panasonic. So it's made in Japan. Made in China. Okay, made in China. So if we need replacement parts, we have to go all the way to Shanghai to find them. Okay, so we've got we're creative, and they improve on what we make. Japan is the world leader in the terms of number of patents it receives each year. Most of their patents represent incremental improvements, particularly in telecommunications, information technology, and electronics. I could have shown you any number of new innovations that the Japanese have come up with. The Japanese, of course, subways are fairly crowded. These don't look very crowded, but as you can see, this young lady is asleep, and she put that hat on to hold her head keep her head from bobbing down on her chest, I guess. And it's got a suction cup. She's asleep as well. Asleep standing up. I don't know if you can do that. Wait a minute. Oh, yeah, you can, I guess. So she's not going to fall over because this thing goes all the way down to the ground. Okay, I thought it was a sling, but I guess I'm mistaken. They sleep a lot in the subways. They work really, really hard. They fall asleep at their desks, and that is a compliment to the company because it means that they're working hard and they're willing to sleep at their station. Talking and language have held a privileged position in much of Western intellectual history. Among the ancient Greeks, Homer concluded that there was no greater skill than to be a good debater. And Socrates thought that knowledge existed within people and could be revealed only through verbal reasoning. And that's the Socratic method of teaching. If you ever go to Harvard, they use the Socratic method of teaching. What it is they ask you a question. Usually it's an open-ended question. There is no right answer to it usually, but you have to debate with the professor, which is not always the most fun. That's a Socratic method anyway. In Judeo-Christian beliefs, the Word was viewed as sacred because of the divine power to create. If you've ever read the beginning of the Bible, it says, in the beginning there was God, and God was the Word, and then He created the earth. Or something like that. I haven't read it for a long time. It's been a really long time since I read the Bible. Anyway, the Word is really important as far as Christianity is concerned. In the United States, of course, the freedom to speak one's mind is a birthright protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. It's the First Amendment of the Constitution. Freedom of religion and freedom of speech is in the First Amendment to the Constitution. So we have the right to say anything we want, kind of, as long as it doesn't cause problems, as long as it doesn't cause trouble. The only thing that we can't do is yell fire in the middle of a crowded theater or something. Speaking is valued in the West because it is viewed as an act of self-expression and as inextricably bound to thought. And because of that, of course, we talk. We talk as much as we possibly can. And sometimes we talk over each other and nobody listens. So it should be talking/listening, I guess, is what it should say. Who was I talking to? Somebody from the East Coast. And the idea was that whoever talks the loudest wins. That was the conversation. So here I'm trying to have a conversation with somebody. And of course, I like to listen to people to hear what they have to say. And every time I tried to say something, they would get louder and try to talk over me. Of course, it worked because I'm trying to hear what they had to say. So eventually we got to the point where I wasn't really talking loud, but they were yelling at me. I mean, they were literally yelling because they didn't want me to say anything. Well, the guy was completely off. He was wrong, okay? It wasn't my fault. He had wrong ideas. But he thought that if he said them loud enough, that it would make them right. That's not the way it works. If you say things loud enough, does it make it right?
No.
Or long enough? Or if you repeat the same lie over and over and over again, does it make it right? It doesn't? Don't tell the president that. Because he thinks all he has, of course he's from New York City. He's lived in New York City all his life, where the loudest person is the right person. So it's really kind of interesting that the media is having such a difficult time with Donald Trump because Donald Trump comes from someplace else. He comes from someplace where noise equals correctness. So the more you say something, the more likely it is to be true. What I tell you 3 times is true. It's from an old poem. The hunting of the snark. However, not everybody feels the same. We are Americans, we feel one way, but in Laos, this is an old proverb from Laos. Listen with one ear, be suspicious with the other. In other words, people lie, and you have to recognize the lie. In many East Asian cultural traditions, there has been less emphasis on talking, if not outright suspicion of the spoken word. So if you've ever watched a television show and they were saying, I knew he was lying because I saw his mouth move. That means exactly the same thing, kind of. So if they're talking, it means that they're lying to you. This is Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu is a Chinese philosopher. He wrote, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." Wow. So evidently I don't know anything since I'm the one that gets to lecture, so obviously I'm about as dumb as you can be. And you guys are the smart ones because you must know that because you're not saying anything. Even if you raise your hand, you're not saying anything. Practitioners in many Eastern religions pursue truth through silent meditation rather than through spoken prayer. And of course, meditation. The Hindus are big on meditation, as are the Buddhists. If we look at Buddha, Buddha's always reclining. He's always sitting. He's always meditating. He's always got his eyes closed. There are no statues of Buddha with his eyes open. They're always closed, deep in meditation. No matter which, even the standing Buddha doesn't have his eyes open. It's because he is contemplating the world. A Korean proverb states, an empty cart makes more noise. In other words, an empty head. The less you know, the more noise you're going to make. Eastern cultural traditions have not cultivated a belief that thought and speech are closely related. And this is kind of a problem, if you think about it. Here we keep having wars with Asians. Well, not really. We had a war against the Chinese. We had a war against the North Koreans. We had a war against the Vietnamese. We had a war against the Japanese. And the reality was that we didn't really understand each other. The reason we didn't understand each other is because we didn't recognize any of this stuff. So the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, was that a cowardly act? Sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, cowardly act? Oh yeah. Sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, cowardly act. Yep, okay.
Yep. To us Americans, but not to the, yeah.
Dad, to his dying day, was pissed off at the Japanese. I bought a Japanese car. I thought he was going to disown me. And it was like 40 years after the war ended, I bought a Japanese car. No, I was a traitor to the United States.
What was your question?
The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was a cowardly act.
I didn't think so, because they knew what was going to come back.
They thought if they could knock out the Pacific Fleet, that they could conquer enough of the United States that we would sue for peace. That's what they thought. And it worked
In the
against.
movie, they said that we just go to sleep and die. Now that
Oh.
they knew.
Yeah, okay. I guess if Ben Affleck said it, it must be true.
The Japanese accent.
Right? It's Ben Affleck, isn't it? No, okay. What, is that true? Or are they cowardly? Sneak attack on Pearl Harbor?
Yeah.
You wouldn't know whether it's cowardly or not? Sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, good or bad? Bad?
When you put it that way, it was bad, yeah.
Bad? Okay, that's bad. We still have a, I wouldn't know. What do you think, Sharon? Good or bad? One of these? I don't know what that means, but it must mean something. Friday games. Bad? Sure. Good or bad? We're going to find out why they did it in just a second. Are you ready for this? I just watched, what was the movie? The one with Kirsten Dunst where she's a cheerleader. Bring It On. Is that it? Yeah, Bring It On. The Japanese mothers have been shown to speak less to their children than American mothers speak to their children. Chinese infants as young as 7 months have been shown to vocalize less in response to laboratory events than European American infants. So we've got China, we've got Japan, and then we've got the United States, and this is us. Much of what is communicated in the course of a conversation goes beyond the actual words that are used and is expressed in nonverbal gestures, facial expressions, and voice tone. So the Japanese aren't listening to what you're saying, it's mostly their demeanor. They're looking at nonverbal cues. People seem to be easier to upset in email than when they are face-to-face with them, because they can't see you smiling. They don't know what you're really thinking, so they get really upset. That's why I don't go on Facebook anymore. I kept pissing people off and losing friends. I kept being unfriended. And of course that one guy threatened to shoot me. People often resort to adding emoticons or abbreviations to their email or text messages to add the nonverbal contextual cues that are lacking in emails or text messages. I got a text message the other day from a lady that I used to work with. And she said, "Happy birthday, I hope you have a really great time." And then she had one of those winky things. I'm not exactly sure. Was she flirting with me?
She's probably opposing you're going to get yourself in trouble in somewhere. Or
Okay, I can accept that. I'm just hoping she wasn't flirting with me. She's married and I'm married. She lives in North Carolina and I'm here. I mean, it'd be kind of silly to flirt with somebody from 2/3 of the way across the country, wouldn't it? Would it?
it's crazy, but it happens. Kidding.
Probably does. Okay, so does anybody use emoticons? I got an emoticon guy right here. There you go. Really? The poopy ones? The ones that are piles of poop? Yeah, those are the ones you use? Okay.
Put a bull in the front.
You use them? Okay. Do you use the poop ones?
No.
Okay.
Bull.
I don't understand poop ones either. It's poop with a face, you know, which is kind of scary if you think about it. That poop is alive. Thank God. Oh, I scare easily though. Nonverbal communication is important in all cultures, but there are some rather pronounced cultural differences in the degree to which communication relies on explicit verbal information versus more implicit nonverbal cues. Now we're going to talk about the Japanese. In high context cultures, people are deeply involved with each other, and this involvement leads them to have much shared information that guides their behavior. Have you ever been around somebody and you didn't really have to say anything? They just kind of understood, they knew what you were thinking and they knew what you were talking about? Okay, well, you can usually do that with your brothers and sisters and mother and father, or the people that you're the closest to, but you really can't do that with somebody that you've just met. And you got to be careful, because if you think that you understand what they're saying and they may be saying something totally different, okay, you may be incorrect. And therefore you're assuming something that isn't there. Much of what is to be communicated can be inferred because people have a great deal of information in common that they can rely on, and thus they can be less explicit in what they say. Remember, we talked about the Japanese. A lot of times they leave the nouns off the end of their sentences because everybody knows what they're going to say. But we're Americans. We don't do that. We speak English. And in English, you finish your sentence. Unless you're Donald Trump, and sometimes he doesn't put a period on his sentences or whatever they are. He puts, I don't know what he does. He doesn't. But I'm sure that the people that like him just finish the sentence for him. How's that? Okay, making it grammatically correct. East Asians are good at examples of high context cultures. Western and English-speaking countries are generally good examples of low-context cultures. And this is one of the problems that people have learning to speak English. English, we finish our sentences. In Japanese, you don't. So Japanese who are learning English, a lot of times they'll leave off the predicate of a sentence, thinking that everybody knows exactly what I was going to say. This is one of the reasons why Americans get into so much trouble in Japan, especially the Marines. That's why the Marines are no longer on Japan. They're on Okinawa, which is, well, you can call it part of Japan if you want, but it's an island way out in the middle of the Pacific. It ain't on the mainland. But they used to have two bases on Japan, but they got into so much trouble because Japanese girls would talk to them wanting to practice their English, and they thought that they were flirting with them. Remember, the Japanese read emotions from your nonverbal cues. And of course, we're Americans, and we finish our sentences. So we assume things from what people have said. And of course, we read it the way that we want to read it as well. And that's what happened during Pearl Harbor. But we're going to see what actually did happen at Pearl Harbor in just a second. The words that are said in Japan are often less important than the way that they're said. So it doesn't matter what you say. They're always very polite people. The Japanese will never say no to you, ever. They don't ever say no. Even if they don't want something to happen, they won't say no. They'll say yes, because it's impolite to say no. So you don't know whether they mean yes or no. Not Americans, because we can't read their emotions. But as the Japanese, they of course can read each other's facial expressions. They can read each other's demeanor, because that's the way they do things in Japan. So we got a problem here. We're having problems communicating. So here we've got the Marines in Japan, who the woman is maybe, the Japanese woman may be seemingly saying yes, and they think, okay, it's all good, we're going to have a good time tonight, and that she's actually acting like no. But she's saying yes, because she can't be impolite. So the Marines are getting into trouble. The problem is, as Americans, how in the world do you teach people that? How do you teach people that what they say is not what they mean? Does that mean they're a liar? No, they're not a liar. This is just the way their culture works. Okay, so what happened with the Japanese? What is our history with the Japanese? The Americans were the first ones to open up Japan. The Japanese was an isolated kingdom. In 1845 or 1848, Admiral Perry went into Tokyo Harbor and forced the Japanese to accept the American delegates. So here we are, we're the bad guys. Through the next 50 years, we opened up trade with Japan. That's where the China clipper and the Japanese clipper came from. Then in 1889, we told the Japanese that we wouldn't accept any more of their immigrants. We didn't want any Asian immigrants. We were actually talking to the Chinese, but at the same time we were talking to the Japanese. And it pissed them off a lot because the Japanese consider themselves superior to other Asians. The Chinese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese. They consider themselves superior to other Asians. 1905, the Japanese kicked the crap out of the Russians. And the Russians theoretically had the strongest army in the world, and the Japanese just annihilated them. That was in 1905. Japanese really weren't in World War I. And then, of course, now of course, we're still not letting the Japanese immigrate to the United States. I mean, at that point in 1905. We didn't really open up immigration to Asians until the 1960s. So here we've insulted the Japanese over and over and over again. We're the ones that forced them to open their ports. So they were pretty upset with us. But we didn't recognize that because when their delegates came and talked to us, they acted very nice. And they never said anything negative. Of course they never said anything negative. Japanese don't do that. They don't insult people. They don't say no. Japanese never say no. They always say yes. It all depends on how they say it as to what it means. Okay, so that brings us to World War II. That brings us to Pearl Harbor. They were massing for war, and we knew that they were massing for war. They sent delegates to the United States with peace offerings. Have you ever watched a samurai movie? Have you ever watched one of their movies? Especially a samurai movie, where they get in each other's face and scream at each other, and then somebody draws a sword, and then all of a sudden they're in a big fight. Well, never happens. No, they're always standing there very peacefully, and then all of a sudden they draw their sword, and now all of a sudden you've got body parts. You never know what they're thinking, or do you? Well, of course you do. The Japanese do. They recognize it. So their sneak attack, as far as they were concerned, was not a sneak attack. We should have known. They were saying they wanted peace, and we should have recognized the fact that they didn't really want peace. That they had invaded China. When they attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked Singapore at the same time. They also attacked Manila. They attacked the Philippines. We should have known it. If we had understood the Japanese, but we don't understand the Japanese. Because they're different. And that's the problem. We want everybody to be like us. And that's not possible. Because they're different cultures. So the Japanese may say one thing to your face. They may say their words may say one thing, but their their demeanor, their nonverbal communication tells you something totally different. So which one is accurate? What they say or the way they act? It's the way they act. And we should recognize that. Or we should have recognized that. But we didn't care enough about them to find out any of this stuff. I know. It makes us a little bit arrogant. That's why we're ugly Americans. We think everybody should be like us. We want everybody to change and be like us. The English had the same problem. And that's why the English lost war after war after war in Afghanistan. They got their butts kicked over and over and over again because they wanted to change India. They wanted to change the Afghans to be like them. They wanted the Afghans to act like them. But of course, they're Afghans. They're not going to act like Brits. We're Americans, and we don't act like Brits. A pause and a strained look on the face of a Japanese speaker communicates the information they have is dissatisfying no matter what the words they use. And usually they don't want to be impolite, and they don't want to start an argument. So they will say anything, stay away from a verbal confrontation. The key information is conveyed non-verbally, with the content of the words sometimes being rather empty. So no matter what they say, it's the way they act, is what you should read. Have you ever left a message on your cell phone? You're talking to somebody, and you leave a message. Japanese, it's almost impossible for these people to leave messages. It just drives you crazy. They'll be standing there, and they'll say something, and then they'll look around, and they'll say something else. They'll look around, and then all of a sudden, of course, they've run out of time. Since so much is conveyed through nonverbal communication by the Japanese, they tend to have far more trouble leaving messages on answering machines. It's a hoot. They are more selective of their wording because they are visualizing how the person on the other end is receiving their message. So sometimes they don't leave very good messages at all. As a matter of fact, they're pretty poor messages. Okay. So we're going to talk more about the Japanese. We're going to talk more about the Asians. We're going to talk about Russians and why we're having trouble with the Russians right now. Different culture. And the question has to be, can Donald Trump trust Vladimir Putin? Can he trust him? We'll find out in just a second. Donald Trump's never been in any of my classes, so he doesn't understand these things. Okay. This chapter is about emotion. What emotion are these individuals showing? These two children from Morocco, they're Moroccans.
Happy, joy, love.
Happy? Okay. But how do you know that? They didn't. Do you speak Moroccan?
Yep.
Okay, well, yeah. Ekman, Sorensen, and Friesen in 1969 proposed that there is a set of basic emotions that are universally recognized around the world. And these are the emotions. And we will, we'll see if you guys recognize these emotions. What emotion is that? If this guy's walking towards you, what emotion is he showing?
Anger.
Anger? Does everybody recognize it as anger? Does anybody see it as anything else? No? Okay. Do you want to vote? No? Okay. How about that?
Surprise.
If you see this guy coming towards you, what do you think?
Ecstatic. Excited.
Excited? Happy? How about this guy?
Depressed. Sad.
Sad? Okay. So far, we're doing really well. These are universal emotions. How about this lady?
Surprise. Scared.
Is it surprise?
Surprise.
It looks like-
Frightened.
It looks like she's scared.
It looks like she's scared. If you saw this lady in the doorway, what would you think? With that look on her
Wondering,
face.
what
You
would
saw her-
you say, scared?
You saw her in the doorway?
Driveways up there.
How about this? How about this guy?
Shocked. Shocked.
Shock? Somebody just shocked him with an electric
Yeah.
cattle prod? How about that?
Silly. Gross.
Oh, is he just making a face, or is that actually an emotion? Oh, somebody that works over at the cafeteria, you know, that's exactly what this is. Okay, disgust. We'll call that one disgust, we'll call that one surprise, we'll call that one fear. She's showing fear. So if you saw somebody that would look like this, you would react to that, wouldn't you? If you saw somebody that was scared, wouldn't you know that there was something dangerous around? We have facial expressions to warn other individuals of what's going on. You don't have to worry about this guy, but you might have to worry about this guy, right? Because he's pissed or angry or whatever.
Down. His chin's down like this, so it's kind of like he's in the stance where,
He's ready to fight.
yeah.
Okay. How about this one? There's a question as to whether this is a universal expression. What do you think?
Whatever. Don't care. Blah, blah, blah.
contempt. How about that one?
Frustrated.
Frustrated?
Worried.
Shame. How about that one?
Embarrassed.
It's a good thing she's white. You can see embarrassment. Okay. How about this one? Oh, I've already got it up there. Okay.
Interest.
Interest. Actually, if you look at her eyes, and you can, if somebody's really interested in you, then their pupils will dilate. I know, but her pupils aren't dilated. She's just. They just took a picture of her, said, "Look interested," so she did. But of course, you can't do that unless you're really interested in somebody, because your eyes will dilate. Guys that will go to a party and pick somebody up like every time they go to a party, that's how they do it. They look at their eyes and they can tell. That and the fact they play with their hair. How about that one? That's the famous Superman stance.
Confident.
Confident, he's pride. Okay. Though happiness has many different words, the expression for happiness does not vary globally. When shown posed facial expressions, each culture is best at identifying expressions from their own culture. Meta-analysis of cross-cultural studies on facial expressions, people were about 9% more accurate at identifying people from their own culture. As interesting as that is. So we recognize our own. Maybe we see it on television, so we know what it means. Whether somebody is, there's a new television show, except it's an old television show, Magnum P.I. The guy that plays Magnum on Magnum P.I. is Hispanic, which is really kind of interesting, which I find just fascinating, because Thomas Magnum, of course, was from Ohio. The original, what's his name? What's the guy's name? Tom Selleck is from Ohio, and he actually played basketball at Ohio State. And the new guy's Hispanic. So the question is, do we recognize Hispanic facial expressions just like we do people from the Midwest? Of course, I'm from the Midwest, so it's easy for me to recognize Tom Selleck's face if you can see past his mustache. But the new guy's Hispanic. And if you think about it, how many Hispanic television stars do we have? Do we have any? Is this guy the first Hispanic television star? Probably not, but I can't think of anybody else. George Lopez? Not a very popular show, but that's, yeah, okay. No, that's okay. Cheech Marin, yeah, but Cheech and Chong is a movie. It wasn't a television show. We didn't see him every week. So it's going to be interesting to see how long this guy lasts.
The one show, Chips.
Chips, yeah, Punch. What was his name? Eric Estrada. There you go. Okay, thank you.
What about I Love Lucy?
Yeah, there you go, but he's Cuban. That's Hispanic. That's Hispanic.
Hispanic Indian TV stars.
It's interesting. We'll see what happens with this guy, because he seems to have a very expressive face. So we'll see what happens. It should be interesting. The female lead on the television show is English, and the Brits are a little bit different than we are. Okay, I'm doing the math. Okay, we already talked about this. Okay, Adams and colleagues in 2010 had participants guess what emotions were being displayed by just showing people's eyes. They just showed their eyes, and they had to guess their emotions. Now you could probably guess what this is, just from looking at the eyes. Fear. Fear. The eyes are dilated. The pupils are dilated. So we know that this person is really afraid. The participants were better at identifying emotions of people from their own culture. They also noted that they showed more activity in their amygdala when they were shown eyes from people from their own culture who were demonstrating fear. So they recognized it as fear, of course. Now, the reason I asked you what you would do if this lady were standing in the hallway, wait a minute, this lady were standing in the hallway, is because we show emotions, at least this is what Freud said, we show emotions to display to other individuals what we're thinking. So if you've ever been around a deer, if you've ever been around especially white-tailed deer, if they get scared, what do? Well, they run away for one thing, but the first thing they do is raise their tails. And they use it as to show other deer in the area that they're afraid and that they're about to run away. So they display. And we do too, as humans, because we're not actually, the reality is that humans are fairly weak creatures, unless we're armed with AK-47s or whatever. I'm talking to Sharon here, of course. I'm just kidding, she doesn't have an AK-47. But unless we're armed and dangerous, back in the old days, back 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, we were pretty wimpy. And if we faced a grizzly bear, we needed to run away, probably, unless there were lots of us with spears or whatever. So we needed to run away. Or if it were a lion, or if it were a tiger, or if it were any dangerous creature, we needed to tell everybody so that they could run away. Now, which ones would get away? The fastest ones, I guess. Or would somebody sacrifice themselves so that everybody else could escape? Anyway, fear is a really important emotion. It demonstrates to other individuals that there is danger in the area. Okay. The differences in facial expressions of emotions across cultures are distinct enough that people can reliably guess the nationality of targets who are expressing emotions, even though the targets are of fairly similar cultural backgrounds. This is the lady from Australia. She's a hurdler from Australia. She's famous because she has this way of warming up where she dances and flips her fingers and everything. Anyway, and she doesn't wear a whole lot of clothes. An American can guess better than chance whether a target is from the United States or Australia. Are you ready? So you have to guess whether somebody is from Australia or the United States. Okay, I'm going to show you 4 pictures. One person in the picture is Australian. One person in the picture is from Show Low. And the other 2 are from Wisconsin. Are you ready? So you guys have to pick out who's from Australia, who is from Show Low, and who's from Wisconsin. All right, here's the first 2 pictures. They're all on the same soccer team, as it turns out. There's the first 2 pictures. There's the second 2 pictures. Okay, 2 women are from Wisconsin. One person is from Australia, and one person is from Show Low. So which person is from Australia? Any guesses?
Those are from Australia.
I'm sorry?
Those 2 are from Australia.
There's only one person from Australia.
The one on the left.
No, this one's from Australia, or this one's from
The
Australia?
left is from Australia.
How many people say it's the one on the right? 3? Okay, somebody said the one on the left. I got 1, 2, 3. 3 and 3, that's pretty good. How about somebody from Australia?
The right.
Actually, there's only one person of the 4 people that's from Australia. So do you think this is the one from Australia? The left. I'm sorry. This one? This from Australia? I got 1 from this one's from Australia. Well, you already voted for the other picture. You think she's from Australia too, the one on the left? Okay. All right. So which one is from Show Low?
The right.
What, this one?
Yes.
How many people think it's this one? Wow, it's a lot of people. How do you recognize somebody from Show Low? Are they that distinctive? Okay. Are you ready to find out who's from where? Okay. This is a lady from Australia. She was one of my students. She showed me how she's also got the tattoo. She showed me how my car worked. I know, I didn't realize, well, it's not this key fob. She showed me about how my key fob worked. This lady is from Wisconsin. The one on the left is from Wisconsin. This lady is from Show Low. You guys knew that she was from Show Low. Now, how in the world did you know she was from Show Low?
Look at your hair, color.
It's dark.
It's dark.
There's no blondes in Show Low.
The one wearing Nike.
The one wearing Nike.
Yeah.
Are they big Nike fans in Show Low?
Arizona.
Arizona, Nike? Okay, I didn't know. Okay. You're kidding me. You're pulling my leg. How'd you know she was from Show Low? Does she look like somebody from Show Low?
I think everybody that plays basketball or sports around the reservation or near the reservation,
Okay.
they all wear Nike or Jordan.
Okay. Huh. So if I go to Show Low, I'm gonna see a bunch of people look like that.
No, not with the
Winslow.
hairdo.
Not with the hairdo?
Winslow.
Winslow, that's on the other side.
Snowflake.
Snowflake, they're all Mormons.
She knows.
Marius lives in Snowflake. But he's not Mormon.
It looks like there's a shorter build than the other three.
I'm sorry?
I feel like people around here are shorter, especially for women.
Well, how can, you can't tell what
No,
height
look
they
at,
are.
Like the way they stand, she just seems like she's a little squished together.
I used to teach at Ashford, and Ashford closed, and when they closed, she was going to Ashford, the lady from Show Low, and she was going to Ashford, the lady from Australia. Viterbo's up in Wisconsin, so I had to communicate with them and ask them if I could use their pictures in my as an example. And she said it was okay. They said it was okay, so we're good to go. She's up from Australia. Does she have a bigger smile? Is it different? Can you tell she's not American?
Kind of looks like a man.
She kind of looks like a man. Okay.
I think the one from Show Low has like
She has a little bit of native.
brown eyes.
Her
Eyes are
eyes
brown.
low.
You think she's got brown eyes?
Darker shade of eyes.
Yeah.
Pretty windy and shallow.
She's got blue eyes. Let's see what the Australian's eyes are. She used to sit in the back of the room, and if I asked her a question, she'd answer me in Australian. Australian? So you couldn't, I mean, she overpronounces a lot of her vowels. I couldn't understand a damn word she said. And people would have to interpret for me. She was speaking English, but it was with an Australian accent. Interesting. So 3 of these, I don't know, does she have brown eyes? Nope, she's got blue eyes, okay. So only the girl from Show Low has brown eyes. Interesting, okay. The same researchers did a study earlier comparing Japanese participants with Japanese Americans. Results were similar to those for the Americans and the Australians. When the faces showed emotions, they were easier to read. Neutral faces were much harder to read. So emotions. This is a Japanese woman from Japan, and these are Japanese Americans. They were American. So they show more emotions. As we're going to find out, East Asians, people that live in that portion of the world, have more neutral emotions. Baron Cohen et al. In 2001 and Kraus, Cody, and Keltner in 2010 found that people of lower socioeconomic background more accurately identified facial expressions of emotions. The lower the status, the more individuals must attend to facial expressions. So who are they trying to identify? Whose facial expressions are they trying to identify? If you're poor and you're living on the street, who do you have to identify? Well, one person that they need to identify is me, because they need to know whether I'll give them money or not. So they look at my face and they see a sucker or a sap. I don't know what word you want to use. My God, that's why everybody comes to my house to borrow money. Evidently, I got it. It's all over my face. This guy came to my office yesterday trying to sell me jewelry. Well, my wife is, I bought so much jewelry. Last year, I bought so much jewelry. My wife's ready to kill me. I bought so much stuff, and I bought it backwards from him. You know what he told me? He needs potatoes and flour. That's the reason he's selling his jewelry, because he needs potatoes and flour. I told him I'd just give me money for the potatoes and flour. And then he said, no, I'll give you the necklace too. So now I got a necklace hanging in my office. Damn. Different cultures will attend to different parts of the face to read expressions. This is fascinating. As Americans, we try to read emotions just like everybody else does. But we look at a different portion of the face. The Japanese look at the eyes. They read emotions through their eyes. Because the Japanese try to maintain neutral expressions all the time, the hardest portion of the face to hide an emotion is in your eyes. So if you're really happy, your eyes crinkle up, as strange as that is. So the Japanese are reading eyes, and we as Americans, we read mouths. Now this gets really weird because our cartoons have big mouths, and their cartoons have big eyes. Some of their cartoons don't even have mouths at all. If you think about it, isn't this bizarre? So we read emotions with mouths, and they read emotions with eyes. So the Japanese cartoons are completely different from ours, I think. I'll show you in a minute. Research by Yuki Maddox and Masuda in 2007 attempted to determine where the Japanese and American focus was when trying to read facial expressions, what they were focusing on. The Japanese read expressions through eyes, and the Americans read mouths. There you go, Family Guy. Isn't that what that is? Family Guy? Yeah, look at the mouths on those suckers. Look at the mouths on these ladies. They're hardly there at all. Yeah, they have huge eyes. They also have round eyes, which is kind of curious because Japanese don't have round eyes. So a lot of times when they're showing cartoons, they're showing cartoons of Westerners, not of Easterners, not of Asians. They have a lot of cartoons where the women have large breasts. Japanese women don't have large breasts. They have small breasts. They're relatively flat-chested. But and look at this. Look at the hair color: blonde, red, and blonde. How many blondes do they have in Japan? Zippo there. They've all got black hair. As curious as that is. King of the Hill. There you go. Look at the mouths. Look how big their mouths are. So we read emotions through mouths. And we read emotions through mouths, The Simpsons. Ta-da! Okay. And the Japanese read emotions through eyes. My Little Kitty doesn't have a mouth at all, but she has two big black eyes. Japanese. They do have mouths. You can see this one's got her mouth open, but look at that one. That one's mouth is just a line. And here we have blue hair and green hair. What is this? American Dad. You can see the size of their mouths. And I don't know what this one is. This is really weird. If you've ever seen any Japanese television shows, if it's a bad guy, he wears his scarf around his nose. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. They keep doing this stuff. But it's Japanese. And these guys are talking. You can see how. And this guy's not talking. Well, you can't see their faces, but they don't have mouths at all, as bizarre as that is. Well, researchers argue that all cultures have similar capacity to read facial expressions. Cultures tend to maintain varying display rules for facial expressions. Display rules are culturally specific rules that govern which facial expressions are appropriate in a given situation and how intensely they should be exhibited. In some cultures, and we haven't really talked about this, but in grieving, in some cultures you grieve by crying. In some cultures you grieve by keening, what they call keening. where you wail. And that's, the more you wail, the more sad everybody is. So they'll hire people to follow the casket and cry and whine and wail, literally wail. That way the family doesn't have to do it. You believe me? Am I making this stuff up? I have a brother-in-law that's Catholic. My family's not anything. So when my dad died, my mother told everybody, "You better not cry." She's shaking her finger at all of us. Of course, she's all of 4'8". This little lady's shaking her finger. It scared the shit out of all of us, I can assure you. So we're all sitting there, and here it's my dad's funeral, and the damn thing lasted for about 45 minutes. And of course, we decided that we weren't going to cry. I mean, she told us that we weren't going to cry. And I didn't really feel that sad. I mean, he was pretty sick. It was kind of a relief that he had died. So I wasn't really feeling that bad. But I've got a brother-in-law that's Catholic, and Catholics cry. He's Polish Catholic. Well, I'm not picking on Polish people. No, well, Polish Catholics and Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics, everybody does things differently. But he's Polish Catholic. And in his culture, in his Catholic Polish culture, they cry. And so he all of a sudden, or right at the end of the funeral, nobody's shed a tear yet, and they had the 21-gun salute. My dad was a colonel in the Army, and they had a 21-gun salute, and the guy just starts bawling like crazy. I mean, he was bawling like crazy, and my sister, his wife, was grabbing a hold of him. Control yourself, control yourself. You know, the whole family, and he hated my dad. He hated my dad. But here he is, he's crying because of, well, he was supposed to. That was part of his culture. But he was the only Catholic that was there, so he was the only one that was crying. He was the only Polish Catholic that was there. And it's okay. Well, it wasn't that okay. My mom was pissed, but we kind of got her away from Bob, and everything was okay. So, I mean, this is culture. This has to do with culture, and everybody's different, and it's okay. It's okay that everybody is different. Some cultures encourage people to display their emotions in clear, if not exaggerated, form. In certain Arab populations, it is dishonorable if a man does not respond to an insult with great demonstration of anger. Now, this is really kind of interesting, because we've had trouble with the Syrians, we've had trouble with the Iraqis, we've had trouble with the Iranians, and actually we're having trouble with the Iranians right now. One of the problems is, when they say something negative about the United States, they really demonstrate. They really shake their fists. They swing swords. But all of this is just a demonstration of anger. If they didn't do it, then they would lose face in their own country. So they have to do it. The problem is, as Americans, some of us are not real bright, and that we don't know a whole lot about the Arabs. So we don't understand that this is just a display. This is just a demonstration. This doesn't mean that they really want to chop our heads off. The same way with the North Koreans. The North Koreans talk this really horrible ball game where they're about to blow everybody up. But the reality is, they're Koreans and they have to do this. It's the only way they can display their anger. So rather than take them at face value, as if they were from the United States, we need to understand that it's a different culture and they do things differently. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to have diplomats, because diplomats understand cultures. They study other cultures. So they know what the Russians do. They know what the North Koreans do. They know what the Arabs are like. So we can't look at this stuff on television and understand what's going on, because sometimes it's just a demonstration. It's just a display. It's the only way that they can save face. And we've started wars with the Iraqis. Saddam Hussein was swinging swords, and he was shooting AK-47s into the air, claiming he was going to destroy America. Well, he wasn't. That was just him demonstrating. He had to do that. Otherwise, he would have lost power. But we as Americans, of course, the diplomats understood all this, but it was the president that didn't understand. And so he started a war with the Iraqis. claiming that he had weapons of mass destruction that he didn't have. So we need to look at a culture from that cultural perspective. We can't just read things from our own perspective. It doesn't work that way. It's one of the reasons why we got our asses kicked at the beginning of World War II by the Japanese. We didn't understand who they were and what they were doing. We assumed they were just like us. Then when they started these bonsai attacks, we're going, oh my God, we're just killing hundreds of them. They're sacrificing themselves for their emperor. Well, they weren't. They were sacrificing themselves for their country. And then the kamikaze attacks. These are suicide bombers. We still don't understand suicide bombers. People are willing to kill themselves in order to kill other people.
You can probably put an example with the ghost dances too.
It's a good point. It's an excellent point. The ghost dancers. That's a good point. I didn't even think about that. Do you know who started the ghost dance?
Considered practice.
I think he was Pike. He was a Pike. But it went all the way up north. It went up into, went up north to the reservations, the Sioux reservations. And that's where they got into trouble, because of the ghost dances. They didn't understand. They have, if you've ever been to a powwow, they always have a victory dance. Well, who are they being victors over? Well, it's white people, of course. I mean, even the Grovon and even the people that never had a war against the white people, they have victory dances. And it's, should we be insulted by it? Should I be insulted by that? I was in the United States military. Did they want to kill me? I've never been attacked for that. Actually, I was attacked by a white guy. This guy had embezzled all of the money. It was at a veterans powwow. He had embezzled all the money, and so if we were having the powwow right in the middle of the powwow, and so he claimed that a big Indian guy and a little white guy had stolen all of his money. Well, the only little white guy there was me. And I do run around with big Indian guys from time to time, so we had, and I was working back in the kitchen, and evidently he was attacked back in the kitchen. Well, that's what he said. So he stole we had these paring knives that we were cutting potatoes with. I mean, they're like this long, okay, with a plastic handle and a tiny little blade about this big, and we're peeling potatoes. Well, he stabbed himself through the skin right here. He stabbed himself all the way through. He said, oh my, and then he came out, and he's all wounded. He goes out. And he claimed that he didn't say it was me. He said it was a little white guy, a short white guy, and a big Indian guy. Of course, everybody up there is big, so it could have been anybody with me, of course. I was the only short white guy there. But then everybody went, you think Bradway stole your money? Because I was working back in the kitchen, and I had been selling food and whatnot. We had some money. I mean, we had about $500 or $600. But I was the only one that could do math, so I was the one selling food. Anyway, nobody believed him, and then they figured out he embezzled all the money. The problem was, here the powwow was going on, and they had promised all this reward money, or award money for, the number one dancer, or grass dancer and whatnot. So we had, everybody had to pool all their money to have any awards for any of these people. And this guy had just embezzled all the money. It was interesting. So I was accused of robbing another white guy. As funny as that is, yeah. I could take this guy on. The Kaluli of New Guinea tend to show their emotions particularly intensely and dramatically. And of course, this is the Kaluli. This is actually the Kaluli making a display, displaying their emotions in a dance, as you can see. That's the Kaluli. Among the Alaskan native Utku, public expressions of anger are strongly condemned. Utku are kind of interesting. They tattoo their faces. We're going to see another lady in just a second. The Balinese have preference for emotional smoothness, where emphasis is on avoiding strong displays of emotional feelings for both positive and negative emotions. If you've ever seen the movie Pray, Eat, Pray, Love, whatever that strange movie is, she goes to Bali. And the interesting thing is that people in Bali don't show emotions. And here this lady goes to Bali to, I don't know, to meditate or something. When Americans are embarrassed, they tend to make a facial expression where their face turns red, they close their eyes and they look down. In India, when they are embarrassed, they bite their tongues. That means they're embarrassed. Of course, we're Americans. We don't recognize this stuff. So if we're wandering in India and we see somebody biting their tongue, we have no clue. Is it time for the music? I'm over. I'm sorry. Let's stop right here and we'll pick it up next time. And I'll tell you more stories about, more powwow stories. No, I didn't steal the money. Me and my Indian buddy didn't rob the guy. Actually, I sponsored a dance. $200. Yeah. What was it, grass dance? Those are always fun. Thank you. I'll see you guys next time. As much fun as that is. I got my first paper. I'm so excited. I get to read a paper today. Talking about reading papers.